I'm going to show you how to locate REST API documentation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This video is part 4 in a 10-part video series in which we're discussing how to make REST API calls. In this video, we're specifically going to be talking about how to locate the REST API documentation that you need. In the previous video, we talked at length about how to send REST requests. But in order to create your REST requests, you need to know what HTTP methods are available. You need to know what the URLs are for the different endpoints. So in order to find out that information and more, you need to know where to locate your REST API documentation. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. I can't speak for everyone else, but I know for myself that when I was first learning to use REST, one of my continual sources of frustration was finding the darn documentation that I needed to make the REST calls. So while this video may seem like it's not that important, it's documentation, just find it. I have found an experience that I need to have a bag of tricks to help me find that documentation. It's not always readily apparent where you're going to find it. So as you can see here in this slide, I have a bullet list here that shows the general approach that I take to finding API documentation. So the first thing that you see here is you can use a search engine. Whether you use Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or this or that, you can find API documentation by doing a search on the web. So that is certainly a viable way of doing it. But ideally, I would like to find the documentation without having to go searching the entire web. So let's take a look at our second bullet item. Oftentimes, the REST servers themselves, if you go to the main URL of the REST server, it will show you documentation. So let's take a look at an example of that. You'll recall in the previous video, we took a look at a REST server API that would send us jokes. And all of the REST requests that we sent used a URL that began https official joke api.appspot.com. If you go to that URL, notice that while this is not very extensive documentation, this page here is documenting what you need to know in order to use this particular REST API. As long as you do a GET, use the base URL, and then in that URL with /random_joke or random_10, that's essentially all you need to know how to use this simple jokes API. Sometimes the people who develop REST server APIs will also set up a website that you can go to see their documentation. Let's take a look at an example of that. In the previous video, we used the boardapi.com API. And again, when we did requests to that API, all of our REST requests began with the URL https://www.boardapi.com. And then we had to put the right endpoint, the tail end portion of the URL. But how did we know what to type? Well, if you go to their website, they have documentation. So they start out here with this nice simple example. So it's telling us here that you can add /activity to your URL to get one activity to perform when you're bored. But notice that there's also this section up here. Check out the documentation. So this particular API has a much more lengthy description of all of the different endpoints, all the different operations that you can perform using this API. Now, in this particular example, the boardapi.com API is pretty simple. It only has GET methods, so there's not a ton of documentation here. But when you look at the website for different REST server APIs, they can have very extensive documentation. So definitely take a look to see if your REST server API has a website. Different developers use different frameworks and different technologies to create REST servers. One of those technologies that's available is called Swagger. If you want to find out more about Swagger, you can go to swagger.io on the web. Now, Swagger does a lot of different things, but one of the things that Swagger does for developers is it creates the documentation for them. For example, one of VMware's products, this is not the only one, but one of VMware's product that makes use of Swagger is a product called vRealize Orchestrator. So let's go take a look at Orchestrator and how it uses Swagger to document the Orchestrator API. If you know this URL, you can see the documentation for the Orchestrator server's REST API. That documentation is actually embedded into the Orchestrator server itself. So this URL is using HTTPS to go to my Orchestrator server. We're going down the path vco/api/docs, and we're opening up a web page. Let's see what that web page looks like. Well, the first thing this web page announces is this documentation is brought to you by Swagger. Because the developers of Orchestrator are using the Swagger technology, they get their documentation automatically generated. That's one of the things that you get when you use Swagger. So here we got our Swagger documentation, and we are, first of all, told that this is for version 8.x. There are lots of different versions of Orchestrator. Here, since I'm connecting to the Orchestrator server itself, I'm guaranteed to be looking at the right documentation. Other times when you look at API documentation, in particular, if you're looking on the web and you're not actually looking at your REST server, you're going to want to make certain that you're looking at the right version of the documentation for the version of the REST server you're running. But again, here with Orchestrator, the documentation is built into the product itself, so I know I'm looking at the right documentation. The next thing it says here is the base URL. Every single REST request that I write is going to begin with this as the base URL. Additionally, it tells us things like authorization. We're going to have more to say about authorization in a few moments, but hallelujah, here is documentation that comes right out and tells you what you need to know about authorization. Authorization is a hugely important topic when it comes to working with REST APIs. And I can't tell you how many times in my own experience how difficult they make it, not VMware, but how difficult API writers make it sometimes to find some of the basic information you need, such as how do I authorize or how do I authenticate to this REST server? Here with Orchestrator, it's right there on the page. We have an upcoming video number 10, I believe it is, where we'll talk more about Orchestrator and how you authenticate with it. But I just want you to see right now that we're presenting that information right here. All right, as we continue to scroll down, there's a whole bunch of operations here in the REST server for Orchestrator that have been deprecated. They're still available. You can still call these, but when we say something's deprecated, that means we're going to get rid of them. Not necessarily today, not necessarily tomorrow, but these are on the chopping block. So I'm going to skip over all these deprecated methods, I should say deprecated REST operations. And now that we get to these more colorful parts of the documentation, we're actually looking at non-deprecated REST operations. Now I'm going to actually jump to the end. As you can see as I scroll through here, there are tons and tons and tons and tons of different REST operations that we can call. Since we're looking at Orchestrator, since we are looking at Orchestrator as our example here, I wanted to take a look at the Orchestrator workflow related REST operations. That's one of the main things you do with Orchestrator is you create these things called workflows. Workflows, in effect, are programs that allow you to automate different hardware and software systems in your IT infrastructure. So if you want to know what kinds of operations you can perform through Orchestrator's REST server, they're all listed right here. So in this section here called Workflow-Controller, all of these different sections are describing REST operations that have something to do with workflows. So as you can see, we can do things like I want to look up all the workflows. Or if we scroll down perhaps a little bit further, we can see how I can look up a particular workflow. Or you can say, if you say get a workflows, that means you want to look up all the workflows. On the other hand, if you say post workflows, you can create new workflows. If you choose delete, you can delete workflows. So just picking perhaps the simplest example of all, get workflows. That says I want to look up workflows. When you expand any of these REST operations, it gives you the information that you need to know how to work with this particular REST operation. So if I want to get a list of workflows, it's telling me here in this section that there are various query string parameters that I can specify to change how or customize exactly how this REST operation is going to behave. We're going to talk more about these query strings here shortly. If you scroll down, it tells you in the responses section, here are the 2 status codes that you can expect to receive. You're either going to get a 200 if the get all workflows succeeds, or you're going to get a 401 if you haven't authenticated. Speaking of authentication, these little lock icons, which are currently in the unlock state, are telling me that I'm not authorized. If I want to authorize myself so that I can actually try out this operation right here in the documentation, try it out, you just need to make certain that you authorize first. You need to log into the orchestrator server. Again, this is just a quick glimpse to give you a feel for what Swagger documentation looks like. Again, this try it out button is super useful. With the try it out button, you can fill in query strings. You can say, go ahead and execute it. When you execute the option or the operation, in this case here, it's not going to succeed because I'm not authenticated, but it still tells me, hey, if you wanted to do this operation with curl, here's the exact command that you would use to do this with curl. Or if you're using a programming language or something such as Postman, here is the URL that you would need to specify. And again, when you say execute this operation, I know we're just looking at the doc, but you're actually executing this REST operation. And down below, it's showing us the actual response we got. Again, up above, we saw that we should expect to either get a 200 if it succeeded, or we saw if you get a status code 401, which I did in this example, then you know that that means, according to the standard definition of 401, that means you're not authorized to do what you're trying to do. Again, this is just a quick glimpse into the power of Swagger documentation. I don't know about you, but every time I encounter an API that has Swagger documentation, I breathe a sigh of relief because it's going to give me all the information that I need in one easy to reach, concise location. So take a look at Swagger. Another place you can oftentimes find REST API documentation is in the response body that the REST server sends to you. When you do a REST request and the server responds with the response body, sometimes there's documentation in the body itself. Let me show you an example of a REST server that is self-documenting through the response body that it sends to REST clients. Once again, I'm taking a look at Orchestrator for this example. This particular REST operation is requesting that the Orchestrator server send us information about a single workflow. So as you can see here in the response body, the very first thing it tells us is if you want information about this specific workflow, we'll find out later on what the name of this workflow is, but if you want to look up this particular workflow, this is the URL that you can use. On the other hand, if you want to go up into the folder that it's in, you can use this URL. If you'd like to see information about the times that this particular workflow has executed, you can use this URL. If you want to know about this workflow's input presentation, that's just a fancy way of saying what should the form look like when this workflow runs and asks users questions, you can go to the presentation link. If you go to the task link or the permissions link or the interactions link or the validate link, all of these links that you see here are valid links that you can go to find out more about this workflow. And the way this is set up in Postman, if I click on any of these, it's actually going to open up another tab with that URL actually pre-populated in the tab. Just before I show you an example of that, again, I told you that up top here, this is the ID of a particular workflow. When working with the Orchestrator Server's API, you oftentimes need to know the ID. In fact, most times you need to know the ID of the workflow, not its name. But if you want to know the name of the workflow, if you just scroll down, here is the name of this particular workflow. But what if you wanted to do something like, let's have Orchestrator see if that workflow is valid? Well, again, the validate link will, if you go to it, actually perform a REST operation that instructs the Orchestrator server to go check to see if this workflow is valid. Again, you could manually create a new request to do that, but by clicking on this link, Postman will automatically open up a tab with the new request already pre-populated with that URL. So again, look in the response body that you're getting back from your REST server, because not all APIs, but some REST server APIs will provide additional links, additional URLs to let you know what the next sensible REST operations would be. If you are working with VMware products and you want to use their REST server APIs, we have a website called developer.vmware.com, and it's built just for you. Let's go take a look at it. There's more than just API documentation at this site. If you go to developer.vmware.com, you can find code samples and lots of other great stuff. But if you go to /APIs, we have extensive documentation for all sorts of VMware products. So these first 6 tiles here are for some very commonly used products, but if you scroll down, you will find loads and loads of APIs for various VMware products. As you can see, the list goes on and on and on. If you need to know about API methods and operations for VMware products, a great place to go is developer.vmware.com/APIs. All right, now that you know several different ways to find your REST server API documentation, what kinds of information do you need to go look for when you found that documentation? Well, these first 3, oh my gosh, these are always the first 3 things that I look for. If I don't have this information, I'm getting nowhere. I need to know how to authenticate to the REST server that I'm trying to use. I need to know what its base URL is. And I need to know the endpoints. Remember, that's the tail end portion of our URLs. I need to know what the endpoints are. If I don't have this information, I'm getting nowhere. So those are the first 3 things I look for. I also look for other things, commonly, including I look for what formats, what data formats the REST server supports. Common formats include JSON and XML, but there are other formats. Some REST servers support just one data format. Other REST servers support multiple data formats. For example, Orchestrator supports both JSON and XML. When I look at the documentation, I go see what the situation is with headers. We have a whole video coming up to talk about headers, but suffice it to say for right now that there are request headers. Those are the headers that you set up to send in particular pieces of data to the REST server. And then when the REST server responds, there are response headers. So there's both request headers and response headers. Plus, I also go look to see whether there are path parameters and query parameters that are available when I use the REST server's operations. Let's take a look at each of these. The very first thing I do when I'm looking at API documentation is I look for how do I need to authenticate to this particular REST server. Before I even look at any of the possible operations, I force myself to find how do I authenticate. Because if I don't authenticate, there's a very, very high probability that I won't be able to do anything. You gotta authenticate. Now, the one exception to that is there are some REST servers that use no auth. No auth, as its name suggests, means that that particular REST server does not need you to authenticate. You can just start making REST requests against that. By the way, no auth is my all-time favorite authentication method because it's easy. And in fact, in all the preceding videos when I've been doing demonstrations, you'll notice that none of them required authorization, or whether you want to say authorization or authentication. We'll talk about the difference between those later on, but I intentionally picked simple APIs in the first few videos so that we didn't have to do any authentication. But REST servers typically do require that you perform some type of authentication. Some REST servers use what's known as API keys, others use bearer tokens, others use basic authentication, some use OAuth 2, some use digest, NTLM. There are lots of different types of authentication, and you need to figure out right from the beginning what type of authentication your REST server requires. Again, if you're lucky, you'll read the documentation and it'll say no authentication required, but in most cases, you're gonna have to find out which of these types of authentication you need to perform, and while you're at it, you're gonna have to go learn how these darn authentication mechanisms work. Word to the wise, don't expect, certainly in the beginning, don't expect to understand every single one of these authentication mechanisms. In the beginning, well, everybody knows no auth. That's simple. But in the beginning, start simple. Basic auth is simple. Then you've got things like bearer token and API key, which are a little fancier, and OAuth 2. Don't feel compelled to learn all of these authentication mechanisms because you won't. You should learn about the authentication mechanisms as you encounter them, as you work with different REST server APIs. You won't know for certain what REST servers you're going to be working with in the future, and therefore you won't know what types of authentication you need to learn about. So I just learned each time I encounter a new REST server that has a new type of authentication that I've never used before, I set aside the time to learn the authentication model then. Not in advance, but then. All right, so as you can see down on the bottom of the slide here, the fine folks at Postman have this great article here that talks about all these different types of authentication. If you would like to, again, I don't recommend trying to learn all these all at once in any depth, but if you want to know important things about each of them, if you want to know about them at a high level, this URL down in the bottom of this slide is super useful. When I look at API documentation, after finding out how I'm supposed to authenticate, the next thing I look for is what is the base URL? Because all the REST requests that I'm going to be sending are going to begin with a URL that looks the same. It's just the tail end, the endpoints that changes. So however you locate your API documentation, find where it says what the base URL is. Here in our orchestrator documentation, you can see that in the documentation it says, hey, you're going to need to say https:// my machine name is sa-vra-01 /vco/API, and then you mention the endpoint name. You need to know what that base URL is. Otherwise, all the endpoints that I'm just about to show you aren't going to mean anything. You've got to know what the base URL is. So, endpoints. This is the fun stuff. With endpoints, as you know, this allows us to see all of the wonderful operations that we can perform through this specific REST server API. So I can get workflows, all the workflows. That's what this first operation does. This next operation allows me to create a orchestrator workflow. But wait, they both have the same endpoint URL. That's true, but notice they have different HTTP methods that they're using. So as I read through this documentation, I'm paying close attention to what the HTTP method is. I'm paying close attention to what the endpoint is, and learning all sorts of great things that I can do by knowing about the endpoints. Different REST servers support different data formats. When you send data to a REST server, it might want you to send the data in the request body using XML format. Or maybe that REST server wants JSON, or maybe it wants HTML or text or whatever. There are lots of different data formats. This is just a very abbreviated list here. But commonly, REST server APIs expect you to either send XML or JSON. So if you're not familiar with those two data formats, you probably want to brush up on them. The easier of those two, in my opinion, is JSON, but you're smart, you're intelligent, you can learn JSON and XML. If you learn those two, you're going to go a long, long ways. By the way, those data formats are applicable not just when you send the request body. The data formats are also applicable when the server sends back the response body. So the request body has a data format, and the response body has a format. And again, some REST server APIs only support one data format. Other REST server APIs, such as the one for Orchestrator, support multiple. And you can tell us which data format you're going to send and which format you want to receive. In the earlier videos, we learned how to send data in a request through the request body. But that's just one way of sending data. Another way of sending data from the client to the server is through what are known as headers. Here in the screenshot, you can see some example headers in Postman. By the way, by default, Postman hides headers that it's setting up automatically. When you first go to the headers page, take a look right about here. It will initially start out, it won't say this exactly. I forget exactly what the text is, but when you first look at headers, it's going to say, I'm not showing you all the headers. I'm hiding some. So you just click here to hide or unhide them. So I have unhidden all of the headers, and you can see all of these, except for the one on the bottom, are headers that Postman has set up automatically. On the other hand, I added this header called content type. Speaking of headers, there are three headers. There are tons of headers, but there are three headers that you really need to know, in my opinion. Content type, accept, and authorization. The authorization header is sometimes, not always, depends on the authentication method, but the header called authorization is oftentimes the header that you use to pass in your credentials. So for example here, authorization is the name of this header, and we're sending in a value that's a bearer token. We'll talk more about bearer tokens and so forth later on in a later video, but this could be a username and password, or it could be an NTLM token, but authorization header is about giving you the ability to send your credentials from the client to the server. These next two that I'm highlighting work together hand in hand. Content type allows the client to say, I am going to send you data in this format. You could say application/JSON, you could say application/XML, but content type allows the client to say, I'm sending data in this format. The accept header is similar, but what the accept header is saying is, I want you, the server, to send data back to me in this format. Now in this case here, */* means you can send me data back in any format that you want, server, but you might instead set this to something such as application/JSON or application/XML to indicate what format you want the server to send back to you. Again, there are lots of other headers. There are some RFCs that talk about the different standard headers, plus the REST servers that you're working with may define their own headers. So there's more headers to learn about, but to start off with, you need to know these three. On this slide, so far, I've been talking about request headers. There also exist what are called response headers. Request headers are information that you, the client, are sending to the server. Response headers are headers, data, that the server is sending back to the client. As you can see, we're looking at some documentation once again here. Once again, this is the Orchestrator documentation. Once again, this is the endpoints, but notice that in some of these endpoints, there is a piece of information that the documentation is telling you, you need to substitute a value here. Whether you hard code the value or you pass in the value using a variable, you need to replace these IDs. So in this specific example, all these IDs that they're talking about are workflow IDs. If you want to look up a particular workflow, you say get workflows, and then you need to substitute in for this placeholder the ID of the workflow that you want to look up. ID in this particular operation is a workflow ID. This too is a workflow ID, but be aware that that name ID, ID is a very common placeholder, but ID is not always a workflow ID. For example, here, these things called organization IDs is a completely different type of ID in the world of Orchestrator. Now, I don't want to go in too deep into Orchestrator right now because video 10 will talk about Orchestrator in more detail, but in the world of Orchestrator, there are these things called organizations. If you're familiar with multi-tenancy and so forth, all of the URLs that begin /org something are tenanted versions of the operations. So this operation here called get/workflows is very similar to org/ID/workflows. The difference is if you're just using a standalone single tenant Orchestrator server, this is the URL that you'd use. On the other hand, if you have multiple tenants, this is the URL that you'd use. They do the same thing, but it's a difference between whether you're using organizations or not. Another type of parameter is called query parameters. With, once again, this screenshot here is of the Orchestrator documentation. And once again, we're looking at the operation that allows us to get a list of all the workflows. You can modify how this operation works by adding to this endpoint URL. Query parameters, you'll know when you're looking at a query parameter, when you see a URL and then it says something equals something, and may even go longer than that, but that question mark indicates something called a query parameter. With this particular REST operation, we have query parameters such as max result. Max result, if we set it to 100, says, I don't want a list of all of the workflows. I want you, server, to return a maximum of 100. Similarly, down here on the bottom, start index 50 says, I don't want to see the first workflow. I want to see the first one that you show me, I want it to be the 50th workflow. And you can combine these query parameters together. Again, whether you're setting these query parameters here in the try it out part of the Swagger documentation, or you can use these same query parameters in Postman. When you set them, so here's max result and start index. When you set them one way or another, they become the very tail end of your REST request URL. Again, you'll know you're looking at a query parameter when you see that question mark. Question mark something equals something. So max result equals 100. And if you want to have multiple query parameters, you say and next name, next value, and next name, next value, and on and on and on and on and on. So those are called query parameters, which is, again, one of the main things I'm looking for when I look at API documentation. Join me in the next video because we're going to talk about how to organize your REST requests.